Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 341. Where will you be in 7 years? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are doing a kind of a bookend episode. We're not quite done with Shemitah yet. We aren't done with the Shemitah year that comes every 7 years, and we've been talking about it all year. It's a year in which, according to the Bible, the land is to rest, and also debts are to be forgiven. And I say it's a bookend episode because our guest today, Nigel Savage, is someone that we talked to in a bonus episode just almost a year ago when we were introducing the idea of Shemitah into this podcast. And because Nigel Savage is the founder of Chazon, the largest Jewish environmental organization in the world, we thought it made a lot of sense to do a little bit of framing of Shemitah with him. So you can go back and listen to that bonus episode. It came out in early September of 2021. And here we are in late August 2022 with the high holidays coming up relatively soon. And we thought that it would make sense to look back on the Shemitah year with Nigel, who himself has taken a Shemitah of his own because he stepped down from being the CEO of Chazon and has spent the last year on a kind of personal Shemitah. Just a reminder that we have our next series of Unyeshiva mini courses coming up. The first one starts in just over a week, so you only have about a week to sign up for these classes. In some way, they all have to do with the high holidays or with the high holiday season. So check them out at judaismunbound.com/classes. And you can click through and sign up for them. They are available at sliding scale pricing. We don't want ability to pay to be a barrier to anybody taking one of these classes. And if you need financial aid beyond the low end of the sliding scale, that's also available. So there's just an easy form for you to fill out and submit. And we think it'll be a really great experience for you. So go check them out at judaismunbound.com/classes. And now let's turn our attention to looking back on the Shemitah year and looking ahead on the 7 years to come with our guest today, Nigel Savage. As I said, Nigel Savage is the founder of Chazon, which thinks of itself as a Jewish lab for sustainability. Its mission is to lead a transformative movement, weaving sustainability into the fabric of Jewish life in order to create a healthier, more sustainable, and more equitable world for all. Nigel Savage stepped down from being the CEO of Chazon, a role he occupied for 21 years, this past July of 2021, and as I said, began his personal Shemitah that included spending a chunk of time in Israel, where he currently is for this conversation. Under Nigel Savage's leadership, Chazon became the largest environmental organization in the American Jewish community. It was recognized by the Sierra Club as one of 50 leading faith-based environmental organizations. Nigel Savage has himself been named twice to the Forward 50, the annual list of the 50 most influential Jews in the United States, and he has received a variety of awards and honors for this important work. Among his claims to fame is also a cameo appearance in the cult Anglo-Jewish comic movie, Leon the Pig Farmer. We love talking to Nigel Savage about the Shemitah year when it was only a dream in our eyes, and now we are excited to talk to him about the Shemitah year, seeing much of it in the rearview mirror, but also looking ahead to the next 7 years. So Nigel Savage, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It is so great to have you on again.
Hi, Dan. Hi, Lex. Really good to be here.
Well, when we talked the last time, it was just before the Shemitah year began, and we've been focused on the Shemitah year all year. And I wanted to just come back to something that I think we discussed very briefly last time, which is that you've actually taken this year as sort of a personal Shemitah. And it would just be so interesting to check in on what is the experience like when you take the Shemitah year not only as something that we do as a community, but something that also you can do as an individual. So I'd just love to check in and how you've spent the year and how that's changed the way you are, the way you think.
Sure, thank you. I had very randomly, somebody at the end of the last Shemitah year had said, what do you want to do next time? And I was like, oh, I mean, without thinking about it, I want to be in Israel before the Shemitah year begins and not get on a plane for a year. Who could imagine such a thing? I have to say, truthfully, the year ended up being a very choppy year because for reasons of Corona and other things, that year, which I had mentally imagined, ended up being, as the Israelis might say, mamash lahefach, exactly the opposite, which is to say I've had an incredibly great year, but in fact, a very choppy year, a back and forth year with very different elements. Twice, I guess 3 times in the end, I was in Israel. Twice, I wanted to be in Israel. Both times, I ended up being in Israel, but I couldn't originally because the borders were closed and COVID and so on. And also when the year began, I was really stepping down from Chazon and really had an open-ended schedule. And then as it went through, I ended up doing different things. So in one sense, it hasn't had the sort of theoretical purity, as it were, that one might imagine or want. I guess in a different sense, that's fine. This is real life and we all have constraints. I mean, fundamentally, I feel very blessed. There are all sorts of people who've had for sure, a much more difficult year than I have. I, last time around, had decided in advance not to buy books and not to buy scotch. I said it to myself, as it were, bli neder, which is the religious way of saying, no commitments. If you fail, it's okay. To my surprise, I succeeded. And then about 2 or 3 years ago, as I was thinking about this and looking backwards, I realized that I missed half the plot, because to the extent that was a riff on the Second Temple or biblical Shemitah, it wasn't just about consuming less. It was also about what's mine is yours, right? This was my property and now anybody can help themselves to it. How does it help anybody else if I don't buy books and I don't buy scotch? So this time around, and also after 2 years of COVID and Zoom and discovering that I had more than enough clothes, I decided this time that I was going to try and not buy books, not buy scotch, and not buy clothes, and that I was going to try and give an equivalent amount of money that I normally spend on those things to people who have less than me. And that I was going to try and do that additively, meaning separately from any checks that I write to organizations, as it were. It's a little bit like somebody who trains for like marathons or triathlons or something, and they were good at swimming and running, so they knew they could do that, but like the bike riding was going to be the challenge. So less to my surprise than last time, I haven't bought any books and I haven't bought any scotch. The thing about not buying clothes was interesting, because there I didn't totally succeed. Like I ended up buying a new pair of like lightweight hiking boots. I think maybe there were 2 other things. It was just kind of interesting because a piece of me was like annoyed at myself. And the thing about like plus or minus trying to give money to people in need, I have done. And again, I just think Jewish tradition is wise. There's a famous machloket, a famous argument. Is it better to give $100 to one person or $1 to 100 people? And in contemporary strategic philanthropists would skew on the side of, I think, $100 to one person. I mean, the numbers are much larger and it's not one person, but it's like you should give a big amount of money to this one thing and try and make a difference. And the reason that Jewish tradition says, no, it's better to give $1 to 100 people is that it, I think, somehow thinks that this is a habit, that things that we do regularly have an impact on us. So that's on that.
Well, that explains a lot, the whole story about the not buying clothes, because I was wondering why you had not purchased a Judaism Unbound t-shirt. So now I understand, and I'm looking forward to, after Rosh Hashanah, when an order will come in. And I just want to say more seriously that the way that you talked about, even the personal side of it, that I'm going to have this experience that you thought so long about for so many years and so intentionally, and that you left your job in part because of that. And then to say, well, it didn't go exactly as I dreamed. Like, that is so what I think we're always talking about and encouraging people to say, well, yeah, you may have that experience with Jewish stuff. And the answer is to kind of say, oh, that was interesting. How do I now go through the next planning cycle and try to say, well, how could I do a little bit better next time? And how can I make more meaning from this next time? So now as we're towards the end of the Shemitah cycle and we're going into the next Shemitah cycle, I would love to hear you talk about that, because I've been explaining to people lately a theory of Shabbat, that says if we understand Shabbat the way that I think most people do, which is that it's kind of a day off, and then you go back to your life, that I think that we're not actually getting out of Shabbat what we're supposed to be getting, which is that idea that it's a taste of the world to come, or that somehow we should be bringing something that we experience on Shabbat into the rest of the week so that each week by week it gets better and better and better. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about that idea in terms of Shemitah cycles, which are so much longer and therefore harder to necessarily wrap your head around, but also potentially so much more fruitful.
Yes, and I want to say just before I do, I was at a beautiful book event last night. Nehemiah Pollan, who is a professor in Boston, I think he's at Hebrew College, just did a book about Shabbat. And I'm just trying, it's called Stop, Look, Listen. And I know there's 50, 60, 70 people there. And at one point he said, let's sing a nigun. People sang a nigun. He led a nigun, a wordless song. And then there was this silence after it. And instead of diving in, he let the silence sit. And then when he finally broke it, he said, you have to understand when you sing a nigun, it's the silence after it that's most crucial. Part of what he was saying about Shabbat, but it's true for our lives at a different fractal scale, is that everything's running faster. And everything is we just literally zoom from one thing to the next thing. And in modernity, we rejected all sorts of aspects of the tradition as just pre-modern, and we don't believe in this literal God, and we don't believe in commandments, and so on and so on. And clearly the postmodern move has been to reach back to older ancient wisdoms and say, look, I'm a postmodern, I'm living in 2022, I don't believe in A, B, and C. But I'm going to assume that this thing that 20 centuries of my ancestors lived by is not stupid. Maybe it's not only not stupid, maybe it's wise. I think that's clearly true in terms of Shabbat. So I think Shemitah is something similar to that. But I also think because of COVID, a much deeper awareness of Shemitah is now very much in the air and very much in the conversation. You guys have been part of that. And I think it's a really significant thing now to bring that 7-year frame back into Jewish life. So I'm going to say this, well, first of all, for me, but then a couple of external examples. I think the period from now till the start of Rosh Hashanah is literally a great moment, even if you don't normally journal, to just journal a bit about the last 7 years. Where were you in September of 2015 when this 7-year cycle began? What's happened in your life? Where have you been? Who's lived and died? Who's been born? What cities are you in? What have been the big things that you've learned? And then, of course, the second thing is to start to think about September of 2029. This Rosh Hashanah is the first day of a 7-year cycle that ends on Erev Rosh Hashanah in 2029. And 7 years is such an interesting frame. It's not 50 years from now. It's not so far away that we can barely imagine it on the one hand. But on the other hand, organizations do strategic planning processes for 3 or 4 years. The electoral cycle is 4 years. Corporate cycles are maybe 1 or 2. 7 years is kind of interesting because it's further out that you can imagine more radical change, but it's near enough in that it's real. I would say it to the two of you, by the way. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's within the last 7 years that you've... When did you start Judaism Unbound?
My first day of work for Judaism Unbound was September 1st, 2015. So the 7-year period that you're describing is very, very real for me. It's also when I started rabbinical school. So it happens for my life that was very much sort of a pivot point. But we launched this podcast a few months later in March of 2016.
So I think it's a really beautiful thing because I think it's a lovely, you guys are busy and you're at different points planning shows and editing and you have other projects on the way and stuff. The notion of just sitting down, both individually but together and or with other people and saying, actually, let's really brainstorm over the last 7 years. What have we loved? What have we less loved? What have we learned? And just do that as one thing. And then start to really think about 2029. How old am I going to be? And I would say, to the people that I'm working with, but I would say it to you guys, and I would say it to anybody listening, I would say imagine it big, a little bit bigger than normal life, a little bit bigger than a strategic planning process, but not stupid, crazy big. These projects that you're involved in, imagine that 7 years from now, they're really starting to drive systemic change in the Jewish world. They've grown by leaps and bounds in impact in all sorts of ways, not just the things that they are, but spin-offs. What would that look like? What would it be? Da, 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 da. One of my observations about the world sometimes is there's one group of people who have like big visions, but never take a practical next step. The people who have practical next steps, which is a whole set of to-do lists, but like no big picture vision. And it's not that I think that I do this myself perfectly. I definitely don't. But I do think that Shemitah is a frame to both think big and then toggle back down to practical next steps.
Yeah, well, as you were talking, the thing that really came to mind for me when you sort of said, when did the Shemitah cycle start, the last one, right? And you said, I think September of 2015. And my mom passed away in December of 2015. And so as you said that, I said, wow, she was still alive. So in a sense, I'd never made the association before from a personal level that a certain part of my life closed with the last Shemitah cycle, and a certain part of my life began with that Shemitah cycle. And what to make of that? I mean, I'm having a little bit of a personal, whatever on the air here, so I'm not sure that I can take that much further right now. But it's striking me, and to connect it to the professional, or to maybe not connect it, but just to talk about the professional. I mean, it's also. I also hadn't made the connection that, Lex said his first day of Judaism Unbound was just about at the beginning of the last Shemitah cycle. Knowing Lex, he probably mentioned that at the time. I did not remember it. So, it's kind of like, wow, when I look at it that way, a lot has happened over the last 7 years. I mean, to think that we had nothing, we hadn't launched the podcast yet one Shemitah cycle ago. We launched it a few months later. And now, there's all kinds of things. I mean, we've had 2 million downloads approximately. We've started, we ran Jewish Live for 2 years during COVID. That's morphed into the Yeshiva, which is this whole new project that's really seeming like it's capturing people's imaginations. Like, to your question, I mean, I don't know how long we want to spend on our hopes and dreams. We want to talk to you. But I mean, I really see, if we see like, wow, how much has changed over the last 7 years, if we can imagine this much change and this much growth over the next 7 years, what would that look like? That's what I've got in mind.
So Dan, I love that. And I want to add, just stepping back for a second, that what you're actually talking about there, on one hand, it's like, okay, the existing Judaism Unbound, what does it look like for that to go from 2 million downloads to 5 million or 10 million, on the one hand. But on the other hand, it's like, oh, we're doing it for the sake of a vision of the world, the Jewish world, the internet, and the notion of then teasing out, not just what does it look like to imagine this thing growing or strengthening, but why are we doing this? Most of our lives, we don't think about that. And the notion of thinking about that in a 7-year frame, I just think is incredibly valuable and incredibly generative. And I think there are a couple of other things that I would say in relationship. I mean, really genuinely, for anybody listening to this right now, and by the way, it's not just before Rosh Hashanah. It's really striking that Hakel, the ceremony that ends the Shemitah year and starts the new one, isn't just before Rosh Hashanah. Weirdly, it's during Sukkot. It's like 20 days later. For anybody who's listening, the notion of really taking the time to imagine this big, do it with a friend, journal it, and then scratch some of the deeper questions. Why am I doing this? If we had time, one of the things I would say to both of you is not just what's the vision, but I would actually start with, as you think about the last 7 years, what are the things that you love doing and or you're really good at? What are things that you less enjoy and are less good at? And then let's play that forwards 7 years out and see how it starts to inform that 7-year Shemitah vision that you have for yourself and your institution.
You've really got me whirling on a bunch of really productive fronts. I want to flash back to a couple moments that you mentioned things quickly, but that I think are really deep. So you talked about the Nigun with Nehemiah Poland, who I've had the chance to be in Nigun circles that he has led or been a part of in the past, and it's really, really awesome. one way that you translated it and that nigun is often translated is wordless melody, but really it's just tune. And I often think that what that exercise, the focus on the silence afterwards, what that is doing is it's reminding us that niguning, singing a nigun is about attunement to a space and to a community of people. What you have in that moment when a bunch of people have been singing together and then they cease and it's silent, it's not just that you're soaking in the silence. You notice sounds in your space that you didn't notice before. You're actually like deeper in it because you've made a bunch of noise for a while and then stopped. You're catching things that you don't catch otherwise. So I just wanted to name that attunement, I think, is what the spiritual practice of nigun is. And while we're on spiritual practice, I'm noticing the word practice because what you described with your own personal observance, you mentioned, the first time around, Nigel, wasn't so sure I'd actually get through the year without buying scotch and without buying books. And then I did. The next time, I was like, oh, that's easy. And I'm going to add the next piece. Like, to me, that's exactly what spiritual practice is. And it's why the word is practice. You do your best. You take a shot of, I didn't mean that with scotch. I meant you make an attempt at a particular practice. And then over time, you hone it and you build on it. So what was once refraining from 2 things for a year becomes refraining from 3 things. And you mentioned, this new thing, I meant to not buy any clothes, but there were a couple things that I actually did have to buy. The next time around, my guess is that you'll have a better sense of the clothes to anticipate for a year, and you'll be able, maybe not over the 6 years before, but like maybe the 1 year before the next Shemitah, you'll be like, oh yeah, I'm going to make sure I have not just day-to-day clothes, but seasonal clothes like hiking boots. And to me, that's exactly what practice is supposed to be, right? Like we're supposed to, like I'm gearing up to take on a practice that you mentioned in our episode a year ago, like setting aside some money in an account and then over 6 years it grows and then you're able to contribute it to either a greater quantity of causes or a greater amount to whatever number of causes. And I'm expecting that the first time around, there will be certain things I don't anticipate about setting aside that money. Maybe at certain points in my life, I'm able to do that more, less. And then, there will be, hopefully, God willing, other chances in my life to do that same practice. And it will grow. And I'll also hopefully be part of a community of people that are all doing this. So I guess I kind of wanted to ask you about, this is a long way of getting at a Hebrew duality, which is lechatchila and bidiavad. So this is a Talmudic term, which it sounds complicated in certain formulations, but basically it's the ideal way of achieving a practice. That's lechatchila, sort of from the get-go, what you envision. And then bidiavad is the rabbis being like, look, we don't actually nail it. And so we're going to have safeguards in place so that even when you're not quite doing the practice exactly as you're supposed to by the book, there's sort of a next best that you can achieve. And that's bidiavad. And so I'm kind of curious if that has been your experience of Shemitah, that, like you said, you start with this idealistic striving or vision for what it is. And then once you're in it, you sort of tune, redirect, figure things out, and then you're sort of better situated for the future. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think that you're right. First of all, people who know me know that I really do think in these terms. I'm not just saying it. It's not just connected to my role at Chazon or whatever. I really do think in 7-year cycles. I'm really consciously aware of the Shemitah year and so on and so forth. I've been really struck this year at a huge sort of leap and opening that Shemitah afforded me. And it's a big move, and it's just thinking about capitalism. So there are now a few airports. One of them is Manchester, which is my hometown. But there are, in fact, I think 2 or 3 that I've been through, where when you get through passport control or whatever it is, when you got through security, between getting through security and getting to the gates and where the cafes are, you literally walk through a massive extended duty free. Like it started off way back when, 50 or 70 years from now, this was not legally Britain or whatever country it was, so duty taxes were not to be paid. There was like a couple of bottles of scotch. Now the airports have turned this into enormous revenue generators, and you are walking a gauntlet of store after store after store after store, and it's explicitly designed to cause and encourage you to buy stuff that you didn't necessarily want. I'm not an ascetic. I like stuff. I like things. I like books. I'm perfectly capable in normal life of wandering through. I mean, I'm capable of wandering through and not buying something, but I'm totally capable of wandering through not only and buying a scotch, but now there's a bookstore and there's a this, and do I want a new t-shirt? Because I decided not to buy books, scotch, and clothes covers a remarkable amount of what is on sale. It's not just that I didn't buy those things. That's the least of it. The significant thing is that it was the first time that I understood what I was walking through. I know that sounds crazy, but it's the first time that I really consciously noted that this was a thing designed to cause not just me, but literally hundreds of thousands of people a day in a single airport, tens of millions a day across all the world's Western airports, to buy things that fundamentally we don't need, that in aggregate contribute to over-consuming the world. We're not just saying this, any of us, there is really genuinely a deep relationship between Jewish traditions, encouragements to each of us as individuals to strive to do mitzvot, to do good deeds, and not to do averas, as it were, not to commit a sin over here. And then in the middle, communities and rules and expectations and modes about communities. And then letaken olam b'malchut Shaddai, this messianic vision renewing the world. I really believe that Shemitah as a conversation is too small for just the Jewish people. I think it's absolutely vital that we take this into public space. One of the things that's happened during this Shemitah year is we've had a whole stream of extreme climate events. Since I last spoke to you, it was 100 degrees in both London and Manchester. We had record temperatures in Spain and France. We've had wildfires all over the place. There is a relationship between that and the fact that we are literally over-consuming the world. But what would it be in due course to have the Jewish community and big central institutions start to think on a 7-year cycle? And then let's say that to our elected officials, and then let's say it to our corporate leaders. That's the place where Jewish tradition as personal practice relates to Jewish tradition as a quite radical understanding of the world that we imagine and have yet to bring to fruition.
You know, I'm flashing to all sorts of sort of Shabbat things that we could find parallels in with Shemitah, because I guess what I'd make explicit is a lot of us have successfully on some level in our day-to-day lives, we've reached a place where on a typical Tuesday or Thursday or Sunday, like we exist on that Tuesday or Thursday or Sunday on some level in relation to Shabbat. And I'm not saying that's everybody, but like I actually on a Sunday have a little bit of, it was just Shabbat. And on Tuesday, I'm sort of midway. Like I actually have, my life is orbiting around Shabbat. Not that I do all the traditional practices, but like it's enough of an experience for me that who I am the rest of the time is affected. I definitely have not reached that or come close to reaching that with Shemitah. And so even as somebody who this year has taken it really seriously, I have no idea what it looks like in the third year after Shemitah to experience it as like, I'm sort of midway between Shemitahs. Like I've never experienced that, but I want to. And I'm struck by the fact that if you look once again at Hebrew terms, I'm in a Hebrew mind today, I guess. Like the days of the week are numbered basically, like we translate them as Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, but the days of the week in Hebrew are the first day, Yom Rishon, Sunday, the first day. And if you ask people to translate Yom Rishon, they tend to say Sunday, but it's the first day, Yom Sheni, the second day. And it forces you linguistically to actually be like, first day, second day, third day. Third day sounds like Thursday. It's not. It forces you to be on some level subconsciously relating to Shabbat. And I'm curious, like, what if Jewishly we had something that was like, we're in year Aleph, or we're in year Rishon, Shanat Rishon. I don't know what the name is, but something where we actually mark regularly where we are juxtaposed to the previous and next Shemitah year.
The Talmud registers the years in those forms. The third and the sixth are slightly different and so on. I will say straightforwardly again, as people who know me, right? Certainly for the last 7 years, I have been quite conscious of that. I might have been speaking or teaching somewhere, and I'd be like, oh, and this is the third year of this 7-year Shemitah cycle, blah, 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 blah. And there is no question. I mean, it's easy the first one round, right? Because we're going to go into the year and it's going to be like, oh, wow, this is the first year of a 7-year cycle. But exactly, that's why the analogy that you gave is the correct one, because the lived culture of Jewish tradition entirely has Shabbat and the days of the week as black and white space. There are no days of the week without Shabbat. There is no Shabbat without days of the week. Sheshet Yemei HaMaaseh, 6 days you should work, is the phrase that we use during the Shabbat Kiddush, meaning Shabbat only has meaning because you work for 6 days. If you're unemployed, there have been times in my life that I wasn't working, Shabbat had less force, because the times when I was working, Shabbat really felt, in that sense, distinct from the week. So the same, I think, is true of the Shemitah year, right? Having a sense of 28-9 as being a distinct year in our lives, very loosely, without beating ourselves over the head, the notion of saying, oh, I don't know exactly how it's going to play, but I'm going to imagine that I'm going to work hard for the next 6 years. And then that 7th year, I don't know yet what it's going to be. The notion of starting to imagine and intend that that year is different and that it's the culmination of a 7-year cycle also then inherently gives texture and specificity to the other 6 years. If we don't have that, then it's just 2017, it's 2019. Last year, United won the cup. This year, we didn't.
They didn't win the cup, by the way, just to clarify. Sorry,
I
Manchester
know,
native.
don't rub it in. It's a traumatic time for Manchester United supporters. People have noted that, like, if you walk around, never mind Jerusalem, if you walk around Tel Aviv on Yom Kippur, you can feel it. It's a day when the city stops. Everybody's out in the streets. There's no traffic. Kids are on bicycles. Now, in the case of Tel Aviv, that actually has some legal force behind it, and the Uriah, the city council, and so on. But fundamentally, it has power because people choose to keep it. If you choose to keep Shabbat in some way, then it feels different. No random human being who doesn't know it's Shabbat experiences it as Shabbat. We cause ourselves to feel it by breathing into it and accepting it in different ways. And the same is true of Shemitah.
The one thing that I would add to this analysis is, like, I almost feel like we shouldn't be thinking about it as Shemitah to Shemitah or Shabbat to Shabbat, because that still sort of like privileges that as this like one day or 1 year, as opposed to, like, as I was reading the texts for Shemitah earlier on, it sort of became clear to me that there's really like a 3-year issue, because you can't really plant stuff in the 6th year because you can't reap it in the 7th year, and you can't plant stuff in the 7th year, so you're going to have a problem in the 8th year. So really, if you are talking about God, God would have to supply us with 3 years of extra food. If you want to take it metaphorically, the question becomes like, where do you take that? So for me, it's really interesting to think about the 7 years as just a new way of thinking about time and saying that, what does it mean to be in the first year of a new cycle? Like, that would be the year for planning and dreaming. What would it be to be in the 2nd year? That would be the year where you experiment with execution. And then the 3rd year would be where you do analysis of how that experiment went. And then maybe the 4th through 6th year are the years where you're really fully implementing whatever your new approach is, because you've, and like, what would it look like if we thought about living in these 7-year cycles individually, organizationally? It just feels like there's even more to it than just sort of saying we're always anticipating the next Shemitah.
Firstly, Lex, going back to what you said, again, the analogy with Shabbat holds very strong, which is that you can't just go into Shabbat at 6:30 on a Friday afternoon. You're like shopping or cooking on Tuesday. Who are we eating? Whether we having guests? Where are we going? Like, you can only have Shabbat by planning for it and building up to it. And then if you have a good Shabbat, it's also a time of rest, and it sort of springboards into the next week. And Shemitah very clearly needs planning. It can't just happen. So when you said, oh, what would it be to just save a little bit of money extra in the 6-year cycle? So you have like your own Shemitah part. And by the way, I think it's arguable to do a piece of that to actually help other people. And it's also legitimate to say, okay, we're just going to like tuck some money away for us, for our family, whatever it is, so that the Shemitah year is going to be different. Just as traditionally, even poor Jewish families ate better on Shabbat than they did during the week.
So I wanted to ask you something about going back to what you were talking about in terms of the duty-free store and Israel, because I was in Israel recently. I was teaching for the Bronfman Fellowship Program, which I love doing, and everybody who's eligible should apply for that. It was a really amazing experience. But driving from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv during a Shemitah year is really interesting because along the road, there are these road signs that say, we observe Shemitah here. And you are looking at a field that's kind of, I guess, not really growing anything, and there's some notion that as you're driving down the road, you kind of think, oh, Shemitah is for agriculture. And I would imagine if you went to the Israel Ben Gurion airport and suggested to them that they close down the duty-free shop, which is not the way that you described it, that you go immediately in there from security and you can't help it, but it is quite enormous and unbelievable. If you would go there and say, well, by the way, this is a Jewish country, and so we really should be shutting down this duty-free shop for the Shemitah every 7 years, like you would be tossed out of there so fast. People, and I guess my question is whether on a fundamental level, we just don't take Shemitah seriously, but even more profoundly than that, we really don't take Judaism seriously in the sense that if we think that it's going to substantially be a detriment to the way that we normally live our lives, then we are going to find any way that we possibly could to not have to feel like we're supposed to do that thing. And sometimes I kind of feel like some people, I don't think most people, but some people imagine what we're advocating on Judaism Unbound is somehow a lighter Judaism, a Judaism that makes fewer demands on us. But I'm always saying to people that, no, I actually want a Judaism that makes more demands on us. I just want to understand those demands differently, right? I just want to say, actually, I think it's more important that it require us to close down our duty-free shop than to close down our fields in this time. And I guess I'm curious about, we talked about this a few weeks ago. We had this extraordinary visit to the Leechtag Commons and to their farm. And one of the things that I'm still holding from that experience was, wouldn't it be wonderful if people that are doing Jewish farming were studying all kinds of other Jewish texts, because really amazing things could probably come into the farming world, that these incredibly creative farmers would come up with all these incredible ways to understand what, a text about lost objects might say about farming or something like that. But it also is in the opposite direction. Like and we've talked about this in terms of Shemitah early on, that it would be that there's really like a missed perspective that says, hey, Shemitah is not really about farming. It was just about farming because at the time that it was created, most Jews were farmers. But now that most Jews are doing other things, we are thinking about it in such a narrow way. But then my question is but how could we get people to actually agree to think about it in a broader way? Because like I said, if you went in and told them to shut down their duty-free shop, they would roll on the floor laughing. So how do we make progress in that direction?
First of all, the Leechtag Commons is amazing. And anybody who's in Southern California or anywhere in the San Diego, Encinitas area should go and visit it. It's phenomenal. It's an interesting model for other parts of the country. Secondly, Jewish farmers are doing exactly what you describe. And I think you had Shani and SJ on an earlier show, but Jewish farmers are exploring into land traditions, native traditions, indigenous traditions on one side, Jewish texts on the other side. It's incredibly rich. It's incredibly profound. It's happening all over the place. The biggest thing, though, is the key point that you were making, which is yes. The more that I've thought about this stuff, the clearer I've gotten to understanding that in contemporary language, Jewish tradition is a political philosophy. I think that's true in many places, but it is absolutely clearest in relationship to Shemitah. We've talked about what Shemitah is and what it entails, but we haven't clearly talked about what questions it's trying to answer. And the key question, it strikes me, that it is trying to answer is the question of inequality. Every single society in human history has had some people have more and some people had less. And as soon as you start to have any ethical or moral framework, you have to say, oh, that's fine. Let the strong get stronger and the weak get weaker. Or if you think that's morally problematical, you have to think about how to balance things out. I think it's absolutely clear that Shemitah is explicitly, it's not about individual observance, though it clearly builds upon it and relies upon it. It is about a societal reset. And that then goes to the second part of your question, because I do not think that this is something that you can mandate. And I think that you can't mandate it in the same way that you can't mandate Shabbat. And if you think about Shabbat observance, even including, let's say, people who've grown up in a Shoma Shabbat family, a family that observes Shabbat, but let's take all of the many people listening to this who in one or more key respects are more Shabbat observant than they grew up. Without exception, it is not because anybody made them do it or forced them to do it, not least because there is no force that can do it. It is because without exception, they saw somebody, they experienced, they were at a retreat, they were at a Shabbat meal, they got a taste of something and said, I like this, I want this for myself. I want it for myself, I want it for my family, because they understood that there was something not only, as it were, morally or ethically wise about it, but that there was something beautiful about it, that there was something humane about it, that there was something that was capable of simultaneously enriching their own life or their family's life in a selfish sense, and at the same time encouraging them to turn outwards and be in however small a way a slightly better human being. Shemitah is exactly the same. You can't mandate it, but as each of the Shemitah cycles in the last 21 years has gone by, a small but distinctively growing number of people have thought about it, played with it, experimented with it, written about it, tried it out for size in different ways. And one by one, and I think not to our surprise, have discovered that just as the tradition is wise in so many other ways, it's wise in this respect. And just as it turns out that Shabbat and Kashrut, keeping kosher, for example, have a particular salience in a postmodern, late industrial world, same is exactly true of Shemitah.
I need to out loud co-sign what Dan said about how I also certainly do not envision what we do as a lighter, fewer obligations Judaism. It's definitely something that I think about that a lot, because I'm aware that with a name like Unbound, it could sound like that. It could sound like what we're saying is do whatever. It's fine. And while there are certain respects where I do, at the very least, I think Judaism should be more things than it currently is, I don't want it to be whatever. And I'm thinking about the phrase we've used a bunch of times in this episode, but not in this context, duty-free. We've talked about duty-frees. Judaism should not be free of duties. Judaism shouldn't be duty-free. In the same way that we're saying we should shut down duty-frees once every 7 years as a way of marking Shemitah, or at least consider it or think about what it would look like to change our relationship to them. Judaism should have duties. Pause for the duty laughs, everyone. Okay, now we're back.
You know me so well.
I've said on the podcast before, and this is a great opportunity to do it again, like, in the same way you said I wouldn't mandate it, I wouldn't mandate this. But I think, for example, blood donation should be something that we understand to be a kind of Jewish obligation. Not that it's a Jewish obligation in a way that it's not an obligation of other people, but I think that it would behoove us to perceive ourselves as having a duty if we're eligible, and if there are not policies that forbid us from donating blood, as is the case for many people. But for those of us who are not forbidden from donating blood, I think it would be good if we understood ourselves as having a duty as Jews to take that on as a once every 8 week or once every 16 week practice. I mentioned that I don't yet have a relationship to Shemitah where I know what it's like, 3 years away. I do have a relationship to blood donation where I know how my body feels slightly different, the first week after I give blood. And then 15 weeks later, I'm more restored, and then I'm looking forward to the next time I give. I do every 16 weeks because it's double red donation. That's a practice that maybe more than any technically Jewish practice that is mentioned in, Talmud, I relate to as a duty. Yep. I actually, if there is something in my schedule where I am forced to push my blood donation appointment one day beyond when I normally would, which is to say exactly 16 weeks, I'm really frustrated with myself. And I try to do everything I can. The only time I don't do it exactly 16 weeks later is if I'm traveling somewhere where I just have no ability to get to a blood center. I have a relationship to that is similar to an Orthodox Jew's relationship to Shabbat, where I really, in almost all circumstances, will not donate at the appointed time. So I'll throw this back at you. Duty-free. I don't want a Judaism that's duty-free. I sense that you would strongly align with what Dan and I at different points have said on that front. I'm also noticing, because I'm a nerd with language, that duty sounds kind of like dati, which is a word for religious. So there's a way in which we could make a connection between being religious or however you want to translate dati, and having some sense of duty, what would you bring to us around that duty-free conversation you brought up before, but a different sense of it now?
So first of all, I love it. I mean, it's what you said is brilliant and beautiful. It totally loops back to the teaching earlier on about the Rambam, about giving $1 100 times, because that again was about practice. And it's saying when you get into the groove of something, it becomes more significant. Implicit in the Rambam, not said, is actually it's not just that giving $1 100 times is better than giving $100 once. It's that one of the reasons for that is that actually if you give $1 100 times, you're going to give it 200 times. You're going to give it 300 times. It's going to be part of how you are. And that's exactly what you just said about giving blood. And I think that's a very, very deep teaching. I also think it connects to Judaism Unbound and the stuff, Dan, that you were saying earlier on when you were imagining a 7-year out vision or dream for the whole thing more widely construed. Frankly, nothing nowadays can be mandated, but certainly within Jewish life. And yet you're doing this podcast because you believe, as Jewish tradition believes, that ideas change us and that ideas shape us. They're not just entertainment. To listen to a podcast once is interesting. I liked it or I didn't like it. But if you're listening to many or most of these podcasts, it starts, and again, going back to your art school analogy, it starts to give you a sense of the possibility of the tradition as something that's rich and wise, that we can own and start to, when I say play with it, I don't mean it in a negative sense or a minor sense, but start to own it and interpret it in rich and powerful ways. I want to end with a cute story, if I may, about the law of unintended consequences. I just rented an apartment in Musrara, which is on the border between Mea Shearim, the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood of Jerusalem, and Palestinian East Jerusalem. And I moved in on Sunday, and on Monday went out to the Arab stores by the Damascus Gate. I walk into one and comes in an old Haredi guy, an old ultra-Orthodox guy with white hair, long payas, long side curls. And the shopkeeper is this old Palestinian Arab. And there is all this shtick between them in Hebrew and a bit of English. The Haredi guy saying to the Palestinian guy, you did such a mitzvah, and the Arab guys replying, and they went back and forth. It was absolutely clear from the body language. These guys knew each other well. This was not a one-off. They were in like a regular relationship. But I was sort of mulling this over in my mind. It seemed not a totally obvious interaction. And then I realized, and by the way, in saying this, I may not be right, but it occurred to me that this may have been driven by Shemitah, because one of the splits in Israel, literally in relationship to produce, is who buys what during the Shemitah year. People who are not religious don't care. By and large, people who are modern Orthodox hold by a thing called the Heter Mechira, meaning only Jews are obligated to keep Shemitah. So I'm a Jewish owner of the land, I'll sell it to a non-Jew, and therefore we can carry on growing cucumbers or tomatoes or whatever's growing here. But the ultra-Orthodox, by and large, don't hold by it. So this year, they won't buy produce that's grown by Jews in the land of Israel. So they actually shop from Palestinians. And I was just really struck that this tradition, which in microcosm necessarily requires that you rely on your neighbors, that even in 2022, that this would cause two groups of people who sometimes don't have much to do with each other to build just a lovely relationship. And I wouldn't make too big of a deal of it, right? But ultimately, society is built out of small interactions with people who in some respect are distinct from us and different from us. And I was just yet again struck by how it can turn out that these ancient traditions, injunctions, practices can have positive unintended consequences in this strange postmodern world that we're living in.
Thank you so much, Nigel Savage, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Lex. Thank you, Dan. I said to Dan at the start before we were taping that I actually yesterday broke my toe. And although that's relatively minor, I said, it's actually hurting me and I feel a bit low energy. And I said, but I hope that the process of talking with you guys will lift me up. And lo and behold, it has done. So thank you very, very much indeed. May it be the start of a rich and growthful 7-year period for you and your family, for the Jewish community, and literally and genuinely for the whole world.
Amen. What a great closing intention as we close the Shemitah year and head into the next 7-year cycle. Thanks again to Nigel Savage for joining us, and thanks to all of you out there for listening. We'll close this episode in a second by reminding you of all the different ways you can be in touch with us. But one last little Shemitah note before we close. You may have seen the news earlier this week that the Biden-Harris administration is putting forth a student debt relief plan, which we celebrate deeply. We're thrilled to see that millions of people around the country are going to have loans forgiven up to $20,000, $10,000 in some cases, $20,000 in others. We also want to name that there were many who hoped that this would be a more expansive loan forgiveness, but even this smaller debt forgiveness plan we are grateful to see, especially in a Shemitah year where forgiving debts is literally one of the things that we call for. So the fact that this came forth in the midst of a Shemitah year is something we celebrate. We hope that it will be the first of many different forms of debt relief that we kick into gear in this country and around the world because it's greatly needed. Shout out to past episodes where we've talked about medical debt. And we, of course, hope that further student loan debt will be relieved and other forms of debt as well. With that Shemitah connection mentioned, we want to close by also encouraging you to sign up for our courses, our On Yeshiva courses. Dan mentioned it at the top, but that's a really good way to stay in touch with us. You can always send us emails and such, but right now you can sign up for our mini courses, which are a way for you to be in touch with us in real time, in Zoom, and with our amazing faculty of teachers. So you can sign up for any of our 5 Elul mini courses. Those are coming up in just about a week at www.judaismunbound.com/classes. So now we will close things out fully by encouraging you to be in touch with us, as we always do at the end of these episodes. We hope that you'll connect via Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. You can always head to our website, judaismunbound.com, or email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we'd make is that we deeply appreciate any financial donation that you're able to send our way. And you can do that via judaismunbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.